he's also a good friend. We've discussed a lot of things. We've discussed music, we've discussed politics. So excited to have you on, John. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Good to be with you.
Yes. So I was just saying to you now. I remember almost 10 years ago now, I saw a recording of a speech you gave about popular music, rock and roll, and spirituality. And I remember you started this talk referencing something that Pope Benedict said about popular music and how a lot of it has this kind of diabolical energy. And better to listen to folk music or classical music. And you kind of you took what he said seriously, but also took it with a grain of salt and said, okay, sure, a lot of the popular music glorifies things that are, we could say, unholy, not very good, but there's an impulse driving all music. There's this thirst for the infinite. There's this desire for some mysterious answer to fulfill the human condition. And when you listen to popular music in that light, you understand it differently. So I'm interested to know, I don't know, like, how did you come to understand these things about popular music? How has your relationship with popular music developed over time?
Well, yeah, I mean, when I was young, when I was a teenager, it seemed that, pop music was kind of a rebellion against everything, including, received faiths and so on. Um, I, I, I remember actually thinking this at the time because I grew up in Ireland and it was a very kind of old-fashioned Catholicism that we had back in my childhood, which was in the 60s, let's say. And uh, the sense that the sense was at that time, and it's very interesting because it's now coming back in a way that I want to talk about, was that this music was not something holy, that not it was a profane music, and that therefore you had to choose, as I've often said, you had to choose between Jesus and Elvis. And I kind of confronted by this choice. I've often said, and I wrote it in my book Last Agnostic, that I thought about this and then I chose Elvis because Elvis made me feel free. And the version of Jesus that I was being given and that seemed to think I had to make this choice seemed to imply that, he was a very forbidding kind of character. And even though that wasn't my experience of him, I kind of felt this is in a childish way, maybe, that, well, he's not going to like this stuff, he's not going to like this. He's not going to like to be around me when I'm listening to this music. And so I'll politely make my excuses and, slip away. And that's kind of what I did in my late teens, or my mid-teens. And it took me a long time, to make that journey, to realize that actually, and I had many kind of moments of insight along the way, but I think it was, reading the work of the Italian priest, Father Luigi Giussani, the religious sense, which kind of alerted me to, the kind of connection with that religion and freedom are very much connected. And that, in a certain sense, kind of what I picked up from, one of the things I picked up from was that if something makes you feel free, then you should actually investigate that and maybe think about it as something worth pursuing, and that the freedom aspect of something in that sense is something vital and not to be dismissed. And it's interesting. I was inspired to some extent by Pope Benedict. And what I almost wanted to do was to have an argument in public with Pope Benedict, if that was not a kind of a presumptuous thing to do. I think it probably was actually a very presumptuous thing to do, because in fact, we did an exhibition in Rimini in 2012, I think it was, and about rock and roll as a quest for the infinite, something like that. And Osservatore Romano asked me to write an article about it, and that was a great honor, and I did, but I talked about the provocation that I had received from Pope Benedict's lecture on music from way back, I think it was in the 70s, and that I wanted, in a sense, to have this discussion with him. And they took that part out, because I think you're not permitted to have arguments with popes, it seems. I don't know. But I still, I meant this in a way that was kind of, I think, because I agreed with him in lots of ways about so much of the music. But what I felt was that I could understand why he felt this, because, I often feel like this myself. If you're going around in public and you're going in and out of shops or, cafes, and you hear this din coming from a very bad public address system, and you're not connecting, it's just a noise. I can understand why people might think this is terrible stuff. But gradually I became aware, I mean, that, when I started to think about and meditate about what Giussani was saying to us, that that in a certain sense everything is religious.
Yeah.
and the responses of the human are themselves religious. I mean, sometimes they can go off the rails, obviously, but the impulse is a good one. It's always it's a yearning for. It's some kind of proxy for the ultimate desire. Let us say that maybe it's the wrong one, or maybe it's not the wrong one. You know, and I think, you know, I think that that's true of rock and roll. That it's both the wrong one. It is the devil's music, but it's also the music of God in a certain sense. Uh, and you know, you have to learn. There's a skill in actually telling the difference or feeling the difference. And I wanted to get this across. This is what I wanted to get across in the exhibition, that there were artists who this was clear in. And not necessarily, they weren't always necessarily the obvious ones, and they weren't necessarily doing music that was self-evidently, you know, sacred or, you know, liturgical in any sense. But it could be like the purest blues, or it could be, you know, like, you know, I there are lots of music. We can touch on that again, but you know, I find it interesting now. You know, there's a very interesting thing happening, and a somewhat troubling thing now, because there's a new kind of commentary emerging in the last few years, I've noticed, particularly online. Some people would call it, you know, conspiracy theory. I don't want to go into it now, but I mean, I have a thing about that whole concept of conspiracy theory that sort of, to put it very briefly, takes all the sinister elements of the word conspiracy and dumps it on the word theory and attacks the theory as some kind of sinister figure, when in fact they should really be looking at the potential conspirator. Anyway, you know, but you know, I hear people now who in the last few years who have sort of, you know, in this period we're going through of trauma, in which started with the COVID business and it's continued now in different forms for the last 3 years, and it's very ominously kind of bubbling away all the time in the context of, you know, geopolitics and the World Economic Forum and the money system and threats of central bank digital currencies and social credit schemes and universal basic income and, you know, wall-to-wall surveillance and 15-minute cities, all this sort of stuff, all this sinister sense of like a coup having taken place, and we're waiting for the announcement of what our future will be like. That sense. Part of that, you know, you find out people who are resisting it, as I have been, some of them who have kind of, as it were, found religion in that period because they see this as a spiritual war, which it is for certain. And one of the things that I've noticed, one of the themes that pops up out of this quite a lot, is the idea about music, rock and roll, being, you know, a kind of a satanic music, which is complete nonsense in my estimation. You know, in general, it's a complete nonsense, and it's very misleading and wrong to get. It's just over enthusiasm for the religious, you know, piety, as the pious aspects of religion, and because I feel that, on the contrary, what actually rock and roll has functioned as in our culture in the last, say, 50 years, in a time of increasing secularization and increasingly kind of atheization of our societies, where these impulses in man for yearning for the infinite and for the absolute and the eternal have been suppressed and repressed in the human heart. That rock and roll in some forms has created a kind of a Trojan horse by which these impulses can be communicated, you know, heart speaking to heart in that sense, right across, you know, the channels of our culture, you know, through all kinds of loops and capacitors and, you know, you know, wires and so on, and to the point where, you know, a musician sitting in a hotel room, picking up his guitar, writing a song, going next day into a recording studio and sending that song out into the world, where, you know, it's picked up weeks later by a kid, 15, 16-year-old in his bedroom, who hears this in his headphones, he alone, and this impulse is conveyed, and it affirms something in the person that is real and that is unaffirmed in this culture otherwise. And I think that's something that has been grotesquely underestimated. And there are so many artists. I mean, you know, and you know, there was a very interesting episode that happened back, I think it was in just after the death of Freddie Mercury. I think was that the early 90s, and David Bowie. There was a concert in Wembley Stadium with Queen and David Bowie, lots of artists, and David Bowie did his thing, and then as he was just coming to the end of his set, he said he wanted to say something, to do something for Freddie and also for a friend of his who was dying of AIDS, and he fell to his knees and he said, "Our Father." It was the most stunning thing. Now, it's a very explicit statement of religiosity, shall we say. But actually, you can see that impulse, you can feel that impulse in the music of David Bowie right through from, say, certainly from the late 70s onwards, where he suddenly began to change. He grew up. Lots of his music before that is great as well, but that there was a maturity about Bowie that I think makes him one of the great artists of our era, of our age, because he understood these fundamental things, and also understood that to some extent he had to keep them most of the time private, secret almost.
Yeah.
So that was a moment of, him, and you can see it in his demeanor, that he's nervous and he's aware of what he's doing. He's aware of the enormity of it. And, there's a moment when he's doing it where there's a kind of almost a hissing starts in the crowd, or a kind of a backlash. And what he does, instead of getting louder, he goes softer. Because of course he was such an amazing vocalist. Yeah. He goes softer, and he kills it right there by going softer. And you can see that this is his intention, to sustain this and make this statement and then walk away, which he then does. He just gets up and he walks away. And it's astonishing. But that's in the music also. And that's what I set out to do with the exhibition, really, to talk about this possibility that in a strange and most absolutely unexpected way, that rock and roll had managed to, because rock and roll started with the cries of the slaves and across the plantations. It's a music that's fundamentally based in human yearning, the cries of the slaves to one another across the line, answer, call and response, these turning into chants, these turning into songs, these turning into the blues. That this is really the cry of the human heart. This is the fundamental, the first cry of the first baby, moving through history, to eventually reach these particular, to these heights of whatever you like, whether it's Dylan or Bowie or whatever. But that what's going on now is really, in a certain sense, quite reductive, because there are people now doing analysis of the Beatles. There may be something in this, by the way, I don't know, but they say that, for example, the Beatles didn't write their songs in the early days, that there was people writing them and so on, teams of people writing them, and they couldn't have done it while they were singing and doing nightly gigs in Hamburg. All of this kind of stuff is starting to creep in now, and it's quite disconcerting for people certainly like me, who've kind of grown up on the assumption that this music is an organic reflection of the culture and an emanation of the culture. But I think that aspect of it is something that, and I got an enormous response to that exhibition.
Yeah.
And to quite unexpected parts, but it wasn't necessarily, to any kind of holy moly aspect of it. It was like, that people understood that when I described the song that really alerted me, first of all, to this possibility, or that awakened me as a teenager to something in myself that was desiring at a level that was beyond the normative, was a song called Ride a White Swan by Mark Bolan by T-Rex. And I did an essay about that song, which was part of the exhibition. And people actually thought, each person who read it applied their own song to it, and was able to kind of translate that essay into their own experience, into the song that had moved them in order to pursue this interest in this music. So, it's you see, the problem is that the paraphernalia and the surrounding culture of rock and roll, the excess and the hedonism and the narcissism and all that, creates a misdirection, which denies the presence of the heart of the artist and the heart of the listener being brought together in this intimacy.
Yeah, and I remember, in the piece you wrote after Amy Winehouse died, you talk about, again, how a lot of the popular music we listen to is rooted in the spirituals of the slaves, gospel music. So there is this religious dimension. And I don't know, before I had my own kind of religious awakening, I remember listening to a lot of soul music, a lot of R&B as a teenager. And I always was captivated by the way that they're able to capture suffering, the desire for love, the desire for hope. Especially people who are, descendants of the slave trade, it's kind of in their bones. So, but even for people who don't have that heritage, there's something universal about this human longing that the singers are able to convey that really provoke me to ask, what is behind this? What are they ultimately seeking? Because this is something I desire too, even though it's mysterious. And I at that point in my life, I couldn't put my finger on what it was. It really got deep into me and made me want to seek what they were singing for. And that's why you say there's a prophetic dimension to the vocation of the singer, of the musician. And especially like what you said about Winehouse and others like her. She seemed to be so aware of this prophetic dimension, this need to bring awareness to the drama of the human condition. But the conditions of the industry kind of, you describe it as a star internally combusting, this, all the pressure that they put for you to become this like this packaged commodity to have to conform to the standards of marketing and the commercial kind of ideal. Someone like Winehouse, who's so aware of the prophetic vocation, like she was crushed under that. Like she couldn't put on this front, she couldn't be fake, and like even when they had her do publicity interviews, she was very frank. Like if she didn't feel like being interviewed, she would give them an attitude. Like she never put on this performance that the record label wanted her to. And you see what the consequences. Like a lot of these artists suffer. A lot of them either kill themselves, are killed, whether because of addiction or whatever. So when you going back to what you're saying about the conspiracies, I mean, is it all a bunch of Satanists trying to bring, conspiring to spread their agenda in the world? I don't know, and probably never will, but there's definitely something dark about what's going on in the industry in the sense that they kind of suffocate these artists and again their spiritual prophetic mission, their vocation.
Yeah. Well, I used to say, I mean, I think one of the things I recall from that essay I wrote about Amy Winehouse was the idea that, the headlines were saying, Winehouse, dies of overdose or whatever. And it's that really, if this headline had been truthful, it would have said, you know, that Amy Winehouse died failing to find the cause of her desiring, that she had failed to find this in the world. And I think that's, you see, that there's an extraordinary fragility about the artist in this particular incarnation, the musician, the singer, of all the art forms. The singer is the most volatile and the most fragile, because they are, like, as I say in that essay, I think, like a filament in a bulb, so flimsy, and yet carrying this high octane, this current, this charge that is capable of melting everything all around them, and conveying this through all of the noise and the babble of the rock and roll industry and of the world, to be heard, this voice to be heard, so that you pass it, passing by the door of a cafe or a club or something, you hear this voice, and it's mesmerizing. Because why? Because it is the cry of the baby developed to another level, the first cry of the baby. It is the cry of the slave. It is translated into an idiom that is somehow coherent emotionally, although not necessarily intellectually. And this is a tremendous gift, that it places the person, the artist, in a very delicate position, in a very dangerous position all the time, that they're on the emotional and the psychological tightrope, high above the audience all the time, in danger of falling. And if some of them fall, and they, there seems to be this extraordinary thing, which we went into in the exhibition about the 27 Club, which is so many artists had just at this precise age of 27 had died in all kinds of ways, usually from by their own hand or by an overdose or whatever. And it seemed to me that this was like some kind of gateway moment, that they either made it or they didn't. And Amy Winehouse didn't make it; she didn't get through. Whereas if you get to the other side of that gate, you seem you can go on then forever, like Dylan or Leonard Cohen or whatever, that you can just, that you find the code that allows you to somehow, carry this current with you, and hold it in your body and hold it in your voice, and gift it to the world, but without killing yourself, without it killing you. And I think that's kind of what I felt about Amy Winehouse more than anything, that there was something unearthly about her. That voice was so extraordinary, and her personality was so, the coherence of all of that, and yet you felt, this is dangerous also. You felt this is fragile, this is so delicate that it can, you touch it, it'll disintegrate, and that's what happened. And I've seen that, obviously with lots of other artists happen, this is one of the great crimes, in a way, of the journalistic profession, is the reductionism which they've applied to the whole art of music in this context, and this idea that it is just noise, background to hedonism, that it's just like, it's, they, what's this, they have all these phrases, rocker, they call it rocker, rocker Bono, or rocker Bowie, like, it's just so reductive and stupid, and I know why so many artists are just so fed up with all that stuff. They
Yeah.
just don't want to know about it, you know. So it's interesting because, you know, I mean, again, it's that this is stuff of the highest level of engagement of the human heart and soul, and that stuff isn't really permitted to be discussed in the public realm, and so it's kind of under the radar all the time, but it's nevertheless real, and that's kind of what I've been so fascinated in trying to uncover in this area, that it's something big is going on, something that can't go on in other places, and that, you know, many ways, you know, parents should really become more alert to this in their children, that when they're seeking out in out in music is really something that can enrich them beyond anything, without you understanding it, you know. Just trust it, trust their instinct, trust their desire, because what they're looking for is what they were given. That's what the heart was. It's the machinery of the heart that they were born with. That's what they're
Yeah.
seeking to find correspondence for.
Yeah, and I mean, at first, it's interesting what you're saying about artists having to make it through this gateway, because you see, like, especially the ones who are extremely talented or naturally gifted, there's so much at stake, and a
Mm.
lot of them, again, like, start to collapse under the pressure of the industry and don't make it out alive. You know, so if we think of the 27 Club, but you also see a lot of these artists who, you know, seem larger than life, like Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, who die in a tragic way.
Mm.
Um, and again, it makes this question, like, is the industry really conducive to allowing these artists to live out, you know, the fullness of what they can be? And, you know, if not, how do these artists find their way around it? And then, I mean, the other thing though, what you're saying about the listener, you see a lot of parents who kind of in this moralistic sense try to censor the music that their kids listen to, rather than really educating them to listen closely and understand, like, okay, what am I hearing here? Like, what draws me to this music? What is it pointing me to? And without that, like, real education, that education of the heart, really, to understand what's in the music,
Mm.
um, at least for me, like, I saw when I was younger how easy it was to get caught up in the cult of celebrity and, like you said, the hedonism of it, which is, I don't think that's the essence. It is a distraction that comes along with it. Um,
Yeah.
you know, and you see in the cult of celebrity, again, there's this kind of like sacrificial kind of these sacrificial motifs that, like, you idolize this figure and then eventually they fall off, they have a breakdown, they
Yeah.
have a, you know, they're sacrificed for the sake of the success of the owners of the record company. But I don't know. Again, it's like it circles back to what Pope Benedict says. Like, you can see how music can lead you to something very dark. It can lead you to getting caught up in things which are a distraction, which aren't fulfilling. But at the same time, like, someone who's mature, someone who has educated to listen the right way, can discover the ultimate truth, can discover God through popular music.
Well, you know, that's really so, and that reminds me of something that really triggered me into this area in the first place. Because, you know, I started off as being a rock music journalist. You know, I wanted to write about music, but you know, I look back now and I realize I didn't know what I wanted to write about it. You know, what do you write about music? Like music is music. What do you actually write about it? This is the mystery, like, as to, you know. Now I know there are some fantastic writers about music, but what is it that they have? What are they doing? And of course, I didn't know really in the beginning. I just wanted to do it. And so you go to a concert and you like, well, what happened? You know, what was the band came on and they were this, and then they did this song and it whatever, you know. And well, what do you say about a song? You know, I mean, the song is the song. It doesn't need you to say anything about it, you know. So what does it add? What is added? Where I can remember the moment in when I realized what I was doing wrong and what the method was. It was I was reading a book by Grail Marcus, a great American music critic, called Mystery Train, about Elvis Presley. Again, you know, Elvis or Jesus. So yeah, and he was describing going along that he was skeptical about Elvis, and particularly in the Las Vegas period. But he went along one night to a concert in Las Vegas, and he was sitting in the front row, and he said, you know, when at the end Elvis was always young, and with this song, "I Can't Help Falling in Love with You," and I can't help falling in love, and Marcus wrote this extraordinary sentence about Elvis singing this song, which kind of just arrested me there on the spot. The sentence was that in the way he sang this song, Marcus said that he could see that Elvis had a capacity for affection that was all but superhuman. A capacity for affection that was all but superhuman. And I remember thinking, is that what it is? Is that what it is? Is that what he's doing? Wow. He's not just singing. He's not performing. He's not an entertainer. He's conveying his affection for the world in these songs. And then I looked again at Elvis and I said, that's exactly what's happening. That's exactly what's happening. Now, that's the way to write about rock and roll. That's what you write about the song. That's what you write about the singer. Something like that. Now, I can't think of an equivalent sentence that would be as good as or better than that right now. But that's what you have to try to do to describe this process. And that's again the way of describing this infinite desiring at work in the performer and in the audience. That there is something going on that is not spoken about, that is not, it's not explicit.
Yeah.
But that this is really that you have to go to this level of comprehension in order to see what it is.
But that being said, are there any artists out there right now who you think are at that level of greatness or who have that kind of prophetic dimension within their artistry?
Oh, I'd have to say maybe it's my age, but I would have to kind of mention the kind of older, old stagers. You know, I mean, obviously, I'd talk about Dylan. Still, I mean, Dylan is still capable of writing extraordinary songs. I mean, he doesn't write anything like the number of extraordinary songs he wrote in the '60s. But you think like he's not an artist who's over. You know, he's not like living off old glories, because once in a blue moon he would write an incredible song that is as good as anything he ever did. I remember one that jumped out at me. I think it was called "The Long and Wasted Years." I think it was from an album about maybe the one about the Titanic album. I think that was it, whatever that was called. With the long Titanic song on that was on that album as well. But "The Long and Wasted Years" is about a couple living together whose love has exhausted itself many years before, but they're still together, and it's the most poignant and extraordinary song. Like, you know, that's that flash of genius, you know, is in Dylan. But I don't know. I mean, I really admire people like Morrissey, Van Morrison. But they're all guys, they're all old guys like myself, you know. I can't say that there's any artists in the last 20 years that have I've kind of, I don't think, pricked up my ears. Nick Cave, but again, he's been around forever as well, you know. Like, but he seems to keep regenerating himself, and almost like he every time he seems to be a new artist every second year. You know, he just seems to reinvent himself completely in a way that's completely plausible and doesn't seem to be in the slightest bit affected. Uh, yeah, so yeah, those are the guys that interest me. But I can't say off the top. I actually don't think there's anybody. You know, I think the artists that really move me, you know, they're in their 70s or certainly in their 60s by now, you know.
Mm.
What about
Well,
you?
we can
Do
only
you
hope. We can only hope that there will be
do
more.
you have any thoughts on that?
Me, I mean, I think the last was Winehouse. Um, but this is the thing, like a lot of the younger people who have the potential have kind of burned out or, you know, imploded, as you said. Like I think
Hmm.
Lauryn Hill had the potential and she kind of collapsed under the pressure of the industry. But she, yeah, like she's up there.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the times, doesn't it,
Yeah,
Stephen? Yeah,
yeah,
that, you know, that music all came all together out of a really strong appetite for a desiring for a change, a new way of being in the world, rightly or wrongly. Let's not get into that, but you know, of course, in some ways, it went into excess and so on. But the impulse, the desiring, was an expression of the desire for freedom, you know, from the in the '60s, and the music just came out of people as though it just burst out like a fountain out of a multiplicity of artists, and uh, those moments have never recurred. I mean, we had the punk moment in '77, which was a little bit analogous, but in a negative way. It was almost like a negative image of the '60s, you know, and that had its own energy, but it was a somewhat dark energy and yet a funny, you know, quite a humorous black humor energy, you know. And you know, because I think of bands like the Ramones, like which were, you know, so reductive in their own kind of commentary on the music, and yet so explosive
yeah.
in.
But I have to say, I mean, looking at the music when I was growing up versus now, and again, like most of the music that I grew up with was like soul music, R&B. I notice in retrospect, a lot of the music, even like the more popular commercial hits that were coming out, there was um, there is a lot of heart behind it. Like people would put their hearts on their sleeves. There was a real joie de vivre, as they say. Like there's a lot of passion. There's a lot of excitement. People
Yeah,
felt like these songs, like there's the soul was embodied in it, and now there's this kind of blasé detachment. You know, there's this kind of, as they say, people are irony pill. They swallow this irony pill, and they don't really care anymore. You know, someone broke my heart. Forget about them. Nothing really matters anyway. Like I see that again, like even in the soul music, which is supposed to be coming from the soul, like people, these soul singers are singing like they're detached from their souls now. And even in like the hip hop, like the hip hop back in the day, again, like people were, it was gruff, it was intense, like people put their whole selves into it. Whereas now they have this trend called mumble rap, where the rappers are just, they're kind of mumbling their way through the song. They're probably high on some drug, but they don't, the point is they don't care. So like I'm seeing a lot of this apathetic nihilism in the pop
Yeah,
music.
and
Whereas
it's
in the past, like it was cool, it was exciting to put your heart into it and to be
yeah,
passionate, you know?
yeah, it was, there was innocence about it, and
Yes.
and now there is this sense of knowingness, jadedness, that
Yeah.
we are simply. And this, I think, you get this in other mediums as well. You get it in painting, you get it in poetry, you get it in novels, where there's almost like a pastiche element to everything. That it's like a kind of an ironic commentary on something that went before, as opposed to being an original flirt of that desiring that the human was kind of born to emit. So you get this all the time, whereas this sense of like parody and imitation and replication and retro, and it doesn't seem to be sincere. In fact, sincerity is kind of like almost out of bounds. And you have to look, if you look at videos of old bands like from the 60s, like you just see the difference. Like the attitude is just clear that these people are real on stage. They're not, as it were, posing. They're like just so happy to be there. They're just so unbelieving, incredulous to be there, and they want to say what they want to say. And now it's whatever, whatever, yeah, you
Yeah.
know.
The other factor is that now to become a star, it's not a question of your talent or skill. Like it's a question of, can we build hype around your persona? Like
Hmm.
you're selling a persona more so than music itself. So that's why you kind of see this disengagement from the music. It's, how do we sell this, the idea, the concept of this artist? And then
Yeah,
that's why you see like these fandoms, people who identify with a particular artist, again, even if they're not that talented anyway. It's a, yeah, it becomes an identity marker that you follow this singer. So no, you see how like a lot of these factors, the commercialization really does change the nature of the music itself and listeners' relationship to it. You know.
yeah, I think that's right. I think the whole machine thing, and that's what, of course, what grinds down the artist is even more, because they're being pushed in certain directions, and they're being censored, and they're being restricted, and so on, and they're not able to be themselves, and they're not being creatively free to, there's this pressure to replicate success.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I mean, I always find this about these kind of people, and these middlemen, whether it's in publishing or in marketing or in recording industries, whatever. They're really really good at telling you what was successful last year, and telling you that's what you should do this year. They can't tell you and then of course if you do actually come up with something that's original, they kind of take the credit for it. Like it's very frustrating to see that, because that was one, I think the thing about the 60s was that there was a kind of like, somebody, I don't know who it was, saying recently that the thing about the 60s was that the guys running the record companies just didn't know, because they were all old guys.
Mhm.
And they just, when an artist came in, they just said, okay, just do it, just make the record, let's see, let's put it out and see what happens. But then the next generation of our guys were younger guys who were hip to the groove, and they thought they knew everything. And so the next thing, they started to control and dictate what the music could be. So they blocked, they functioned as like genuine middlemen, blocking gatekeepers on the creativity of the artists. I forget what it was. A very good point I saw recently. Some artists were saying that. Uh, it might come back to me before we finish, but I think that's kind of one of the things that happened, that, you just need to trust if somebody's got an energy and a desire to communicate something, and they have that magic thing, because you can hear it in an artist, like in 3 or 4 notes of vocal or of guitar intro. You can hear this is something different, and that arresting sense of, you hear it on a public address system, and it's like 2 bars and you're caught. And what's that? And then you used to spend 3 months trying to hear it again, or what was that about? It was, something about a shoe. What was it? Please tell me, a song about a shoe? Like, and of course now you can just kind of repeat 1 or 2 words into Google or something, and it tells you what the song was and where the artist was born, and what age, and who he's married to, and whatever.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, I wanted to quickly switch gears, moving a little bit away from the popular culture into the politics, because one of the things you touched on in your book, Lapsed Agnostic, which is for me one of the most powerful ones, in addition to things about popular culture, is the political situation in Ireland, and you had some really fascinating, kind of surprising takes about the reality of colonialism. And it struck me because usually you see that colonialism is a pet issue of progressives, so-called liberals, and those who may not identify with those political causes tend to downplay the extent to which colonialism is problematic, but also the psychological and the spiritual effects that it has on a people, on a
Mm.
nation. And I think like what usually happens within maybe we could say the Marxist or the post-structuralist critique of colonialism is that it's an unjust power dynamic. It's about, it's one entity who's more powerful taking power away from a weaker entity. This again, this Hegelian dialectic. But the way you were coming at it, it was a matter of injustice, but it's about like taking away the freedom of a people to take up a call, to take up a responsibility to fulfill their calling as a nation, as a community, we could say.
Yeah.
And like it touching on kind of ideals like subsidiarity, solidarity. Um, and you mentioned Frantz Fanon, who has a very particular view of it that I don't know, but you have a lot of overlap with his critique. So I don't know. I'm curious to hear more about how you've developed that critique of colonialism, especially as it applies to the situation in Ireland.
Yeah, well, you see, Ireland was, they say Ireland was never colonized by Britain, which technically is true. They just said we were part of the British Empire, but we weren't. We were a separate island, and they were using us as a breadbasket, and we didn't really have any say in who we belonged to or what our identity was to be. And anyway, colonialism is a psychological process first and foremost. It's like Fanon said about that there's a really clear sentence where he says that the first thing that the colonizer does on arrival in a new territory is impress upon the consciousness of the native that before the advent of colonialism there was nothing but savagery, or I think barbarism is the word to use, barbarism. So in other words, then the people need to adjust themselves to be like the master, like the colonizer, and that's the fundamental impulse of colonialism. Now, when I read Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth and Black Skin, White Mass, I said these books are about Ireland and all but the color of the skin, because they're about the Irish experience of subjugation, of the imposition of self-hatred, of mimicry, all of these pathologies that go with the post-colonial condition. And I find it really interesting now because I run into trouble quite frequently now, or find myself in disagreement with people who are on the same side of lots of arguments in other respects. That they say, oh, you're aligning yourself with that left wing kind of critical race theory, kind of post-culture Marxist view of the world. And I say, no, I'm not. I'm just acknowledging what actually happened. Just because it's inconvenient, because a certain faction have adopted a particular critique and taken certain elements of truthful witnessing through history as part of their panoply of instruments, doesn't mean that we have to then abandon that and say, well, no, we don't do it. Like, it's a bit like, in the context of Marxism in a slightly narrower sense, people kind of expect you to repudiate everything to do with Marx if you want to take a certain line on things. But I mean, I kind of, and there's lots to repudiate in Marx, but there's also lots to actually say, well, actually, he got that right. I mean, his concept of the ownership of the means of production is a vital concept, which very particularly so now in the present age of technology and coming age of AI. It's a very pressing issue, which we have allowed to become, fall away by virtue of our kind of almost nervousness about talking about Marx, or even allowing ourselves to be seen or to be taken for a crypto Marxist. So the thing about this whole Fanon thing was like colonialism happened, and it was bad for many people. And now the core argument, I get into this, and I've had this discussion and with people like Stefan Molyneux is a very good philosopher, blogger from Canada, and he talks about this, and he takes a very kind of purist line that it's very clear that the West, Britain, Spain, Portugal, these countries offered civilization to the third world, to other countries, and that this was a great gift. Okay, there was some bad stuff that happened, but overall it was a good deal, and they became modern. But I say, well, okay, but what's modern and what's civilization? And can we choose our own way of becoming civilized? Is that possible? Is that permitted? Do we have to be beaten into particular forms of civilization? Is that not itself a paradox, if not an oxymoron? You know, this so you know, you may well decide objectively that Western civilization, as it was presented, you know, in these situations, was the most advanced civilization of its time, or perhaps of any time, and you're not entirely sure what criteria you would apply for that. But you know, in general, you would look at the overall picture and say, in material terms, that would be true. But perhaps they're the countries that are inflicted with these kind of gifts are losing other things as a consequence. Certainly in Ireland, in the case of Ireland, we lost our language, which I think was a great, you know, a mortal wound to our nation, and has been at the heart of so much of our misfortune ever since. You know, we lost, you know, we almost lost our faith. I mean, the penal laws which came to bear on England and Ireland, on Britain and Ireland, had a hugely traumatic effect on Ireland. And I think I wrote an article in First Things a few years ago about this, and about Fanon, and just, you know, I think, you know, what would Fanon have said to these people? He said, well, you know, okay, you civilization, but it's not ours.
Yeah.
And that's the end of it.
Mm.
We don't want it. Is it okay if we don't want it? You know, and I think it must be okay. It must be okay if people say no, because who is to say objectively that this civilization, just because it makes people more prosperous, is a better civilization? You know, who's to say that prosperity and happiness offer some kind of equivalence? Because they don't. We know this from the Easterlin paradox, that, you know, up to a certain point, you know, there's a correlation between money and happiness. It takes, say, X amounts of money to get you Y amount of happiness. But then after that, to get 2Y costs you like 10 times as much money. And so therefore, there's not a clear correlation between the two phenomena. And yet our mythology of our culture assumes that there is. You know, you just look at the materialist societies we've generated now, where people are running raw every day, parents trying to keep the roof over their heads while they're dumping their children in creches at 7 o'clock in the morning, and rushing to collect them at 6:30 in the evening. You know, like, is this civilization? Like, really? Like, can we discuss these things? So that's kind of approximately the area in which I see a lot of this discussion having kind of gone off the rails. You know, that it's like as if it's quite evident that, you know, people say, well, you know, you guys in Ireland, like, you wouldn't have any proper buildings if the British hadn't come. And I said, well, we would have, but they would have been our buildings.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think first, what's most interesting to me is to understand the psychological effects that colonization has, because I don't know, I mean, clearly every situation, every circumstance of colonization is different. But I've seen it. I've seen, like, especially in friendships, working with people who are from historically colonized countries, you see that they're still grappling with the after effect of their agency being robbed of them, the sense that they have the freedom to take responsibility for themselves, take ownership of their lives, their cultures. And there are all kinds of ways that they try to compensate, you know, that until that wound is resolved, in personally but also collectively, like, it leads to a lot more trauma and destructiveness. So it's, you know, like you said, like, we have to be realistic about the actual effects that it has on people. But again, from a more a moral, a philosophical point of view, I mean, again, it's for an outsider to come in and to feed to people this narrative that your culture is inferior, ours is better, and we're just going to uproot everything and impose this externally onto you. Like, needless to say, that's damaging, because I don't know. And like, what concerns me is, like, I see a lot of people, again, from a more conservative, classicist, or traditional bent, saying, well, oh, well, certain civilizations are barbaric, they are inferior. So Western nations needed to come and bring in their civilization, their morals, their religion. And I don't know, I especially see that a lot because I studied Spanish literature, so we covered a lot of Latin American history. And you see people who say, yeah, I mean, if Columbus didn't come, like, Latin America wouldn't be Christian, and they'd still be doing blood sacrifices, human sacrifices. And I mean, that's such a facile argument because, I mean, first of all, there are plenty of pagan Western nations, European nations, that were doing equally grotesque sacrifices, inhumane things. But also, I mean, from a true, like, Christian perspective, it ignores the fact that, like, there is this inherent dignity within the people, and that there is something redeemable about every culture, and that the true missionary work, the true work of evangelization, is not to uproot a people from their culture, not to erase everything, but to look within their culture and say, okay, like where are there hints of truth here? Like where is Christ already at work in this culture, and try to cultivate that. And I mean, the question that I have that I've been really thinking about is like, especially considering, Catholic European nations going to other countries around the world. Um, I don't know, like you see that the missionaries often depended on the economic resources of the imperial crown. And that was, I mean, that was the economic reality of the time. But you also see how these missionaries compromised themselves, because they weren't only going to bring the faith, like they're going to bring, again, this imperialist colonizing mentality that, needless to say, was extremely destructive on these cultures. So I don't know, it's anachronistic to condemn the missionaries for choosing to collaborate with the crown. But I don't know. I mean, what do you make, for at least from like the
Well,
perspective?
yeah, this has been an aspect of the thing that has always troubled me,
Yeah.
because, well, which are reasons I'll come back to. But clearly, yes, there's a real problem here, because really what's happening is, these countries didn't go to Africa or to Ireland or wherever to bring civilization. They went to plunder. They went to plunder, right? And the missionaries who accompanied them, did provide a gracing aspect for that plunder. That has to be conceded. I mean, Ireland never had a historical kind of history of imperialism, colonialism, as an aggressor, but it did actually bring many missionaries, provide many missionaries for these escapades in other places, in Africa in particular, and that's a little somewhat open wound, in my view. I think it needs to be talked about. I think in some respects, there's an essay I wrote in First Things too about it. Was the American or the Australian writer Peter Carey, in one of his books, and his most recent book, I think, and I'm sorry that I can't remember the title of it right now, but it's about Australia, and it's about their Aboriginal experience, and there's a very telling scene in the book where a quite complicated scene, but there's a discussion between an old Australian man and a woman who they're discussing. She has found the skeleton of an Aboriginal child in alongside the roadside, in ancient, which has come somehow a skeleton, and she takes it to this man, and they're discussing the general situation of the colonial period, or the entire history of the Aborigines and the white people, as it were, and she then, as an afterthought, says, "Oh, shall I take the child with me, and or the skeleton with me?" And he says, "Well, whatever you want." And she says, "Well, I want to do the right thing." And he then says, "There is no right thing." You see, this is the problem with the present moment, that everybody's trying to kind of rectify things that are not rectifiable. You can't reach back into history and right everything. And by the same token, if you then carry the grievances of that history forward, this is not something that I want to do. I think this assumption is always made when you even want to discuss these matters, that you are trying to dig up the past and parade your grievances and start tearing down statues. That doesn't follow at all. The important aspect of this is that we discuss it so that we have a truthful memory of what happened. The point is, you can't rectify the past, certainly not by creating new horrors in the present, as though to counterbalance those. And that's essentially what's happening now. Now, that may well seem to be, a self-serving argument from a pasty-faced Caucasian. But the reality is that this is true, that our world, we in Ireland, for example, we're in this extraordinary situation where we have a great deal more in common with people from Africa who've had a colonial experience than we have with our neighbors. And yet they come to Ireland and call us racist because our faces are pale. These are problems. We're importing all this critical race theory from America, even though it has no basis in our history whatsoever. Like, our history is entirely other, entirely different. And the reality is about this, that we in our cultures, the inheritance of colonialism is manifold. I know, just to go a little bit through it, in Ireland, we can see it in the modern disposition of Irish people, where they are constantly seeking to apologize for any suggestion of backwardness, whether it's in religiosity or in any kind of traditional way of being, or in nostalgia. Any of those kind of things are regarded as very suspect. And it's the impulse is always a desire to disperse any criticism on the basis of the accusations that have been leveled against us from that moment that Fanon described. The first thing when the colonizer arrives is to impose upon the consciousness the idea that before there was nothing but savagery. It is like the entire life of the nation is dedicated to disproving this implication. And, that the solution, therefore, is mimicry. We unbecome ourselves. We imitate the colonizer, the master. We are terrified in his presence, in his accent, by his accent, but yet we try to speak like him, and so on. And we are revolted when a member of our own race seems to revert to type in public and speak in a coarse way, or a guttural way, which is the Irish language, an intensely guttural language. And that's why it has become deeply disapproved of in Ireland, culturally, even though there's a lot of lip service paid for it. Almost nobody can speak it now. It has almost died out, except in tiny little hamlets sprinkled around the west of Ireland. And similarly, the music, it's like, much more popular in Germany than it is in Ireland, than our own traditional music. And this is self-hatred, is a part of the post-colonial inheritance. And these are things that people need to own up to, because if you don't, you repeat the pathologies through history. And this is exactly what's happening through us now, as we seek to become the most progressive country in the world and tell each other that we are now the wealthiest country in the world, even though the only basis for that claim is that we are the best, tax defrauding locus in the entire world. This is the place. If you want to dodge tax anywhere, come to Ireland, we'll fix it for you. That's our USP. That's our principal activity. We are a prostitute nation. We have virtually zero actual indigenous economy. It's all fraudulent stuff done with mirrors and smoke. So these are the legacy. This is the legacy, and I've been talking about this for 35 years, trying to draw attention to this. And now we're on the cusp of disintegration, even though people now still to this day describe Ireland as the richest country in the world. It's ridiculous. Like, what happened? Look, I've said a million times about Ireland that this is what happened. It's like, this is the analogy I use. Our grandfather died. He left us premises on the main street, a shop premises and a living quarters overhead. We couldn't figure out what to do with it. We thought, what would we sell in this shop? We sat in the cafe across the street looking at the frontage for several weeks, looking over and saying, what could we sell in the shop? And then we had the brilliant idea, hey, why don't we just rent out the shop and live upstairs? That's Ireland now. Yeah. And that's the direct consequence of that colonial experience, unacknowledged in our culture and unacknowledged in our thoughts and in our imagination. That's the foundational problem of all of Ireland's difficulties, which continue.
Yeah, and this is what you were saying at the end of that first things piece, that this, I don't know, we see the globalization of this homogenized, elitist kind of worldview spreading all over. I mean, whether Ireland, countries in Europe, or even beyond, where at the end of the day, it's this, the Pope has used this word, it's this ideological colonization. It's uprooting people from their own culture, their traditions, and imposing something very foreign, something not really human onto them. And yet it's presented as something very humanistic, something liberating, so it's it's very deceptive.
Well, you see, I had a rather forlorn hope maybe about 30 years ago. I wrote a book, ironically, bringing all of this together in one place. I wrote a book called Race of Angels back about 1994, which was about Ireland, but it was also about U2. U2 was the central motif in the book. And the point of the book was really to ask the question, is it possible for an impulse, cultural impulse in a culture, to survive and change modes, move through various other modes and re-erupt much later in an entirely different form? And so I was exploring Irish culture going back to the Middle Ages and coming into this modern expression of articulacy, or whatever you would call it, in U2. And this was the time of the Joshua Tree and Achtung Baby, and their best albums. That was at the core of that. Then was this whole question about colonialism and the history of Ireland, and whether or not we could actually overcome this. And one of the things I was discussing was the imminence, as I anticipated, of new forms of colonialism, mainly to do with corporations, corporate colonialism, which is now a reality in around the globe, and very much a reality in Ireland. That's what's happened. But I thought, and this is something which was almost like the conclusion of the book, that the memory of our experience and the learning that we had at least acquired in that experience had made us probably the most qualified country on earth to be to understand, to comprehend the coming era, and to find a way of, you know, limbo dancing around it.
Mhm.
And I saw U2 as a major force in that. But ironically, you know, U2 have gone to the dark side, frankly, and their music has gone to pot. And uh, Ireland has continued down this abysmal path, learning nothing, remembering nothing, you know, making no deductions from anything. And so we just blunder along from disaster to disaster into the ultimate disaster, where it seems now that, you know, we are being reduced to a bundle of chits
Mhm.
owned by BlackRock. And one day a knock will come on the door and say, actually, we own your country. Could you please move out?
Yeah, no, and again, we were saying this before we recorded that so much of the way this is packaged is as if it's something again, something liberating, something progressive that's gonna, you know, bring about greater prosperity, greater peace. But again, like at the end of the day, the more power is concentrated amongst the few, then the less agency that people have, and that this is ultimately what gives people dignity: the fact that they have the agency to take up their responsibilities, to make something meaningful of their lives and their communities.
Have you, Stephen, any real sense of any potential or possible in understanding or explanation for this syndrome that I just wanted to describe? Because you know, you're a much younger man than I am, but you know, I find myself, you know, completely consternated and bamboozled and you know, bereft to watch in the last few years this sense of what I would have called the liberal establishments of our countries, you know, who seem to stand for progressive ideas. I don't mean just in the kind of cliched sense of, you know, that kind of liberal agenda, but in a general sense, freedom, you know, progress, you know, moving forward and so on. That these people have just this like just they've left down their weapons in the
Yeah.
last few years.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, but I'm starting to see more and more young people catching on to what's happening and doing something about it. You know, there are a lot of intelligent people who can see through what's going on. And I think like ultimately what's most hopeful is seeing first there's like an existential kind of spiritual revolution, like people seeking some kind of truth that transcends whatever negative things are happening in the political or cultural sphere. Like there has to be something ultimate that promises us that even if everything collapses, there's something worth living for. So I think that's number one. But then on the political and cultural level, like I'm seeing these movements towards localism, like towards actually building sustainable communities, getting involved in local politics where actual changes can be made. I think on the pragmatic level, like that's a hopeful thing to be seeing. And of course, there are people who are aware of what's going on who jump into these ideological kind of projects, which I think are a dead end. But again, I think it's a matter of like we have to be concrete. At the local level, there are things to be done. There are people who I live nearby, people who I see every day, who I can share life with and build something with, as much as you know, as much as we can. But so I think yeah, like I see things happening, and I don't know if the powers that be will allow much of these things to really to grow, to blossom, but at least people are trying, at least people are aware, you know. So
Yeah.
that's good
You know,
me.
what has been shocking for me is the idea that, you know, I come from a generation that rebelled against capitalism, against the man, you know, against power in that sense, and you know, the abuses of power, you know, against, you know, right-wing tyranny, you know, and so on, and against, you know, what happened in Chile and what happened in different other countries, you know, Nicaragua and El Salvador and all this, you know, and U2 did all these songs, you know, Bullet the Blue Sky, you know, about that, you know, yeah, about El Salvador, you know, and you know that famous line where Bono says, you know, as you know, put the grief and pain of El Salvador through your guitar or something like that, you know, and which became a bit of an in joke among uh, music heads. But you know, then one day it's like they decided, nah, we don't really care about any of that stuff anymore. You know, those rich guys can just have it all their own way. We're not going to do anything about that. We don't mind. They're so, in fact, now these guys are so rich that we're not even going to bother talking about. There's nothing they can we do with it. We're just going to give it to them, and we're going to be part of their thing. You know, we're going to be, we'll work with those guys. You know, that's kind of what it's come down to, hasn't it?
No, I mean that seems to be the case. Yeah, but No, but again, I think it's important for people who have these questions, who have this awareness, to try to connect with people, to keep these conversations going, because it's very easy to feel isolated, to feel helpless. And it's not, I don't think that has to be the case. I think yes, you have to you have to search for those people. You have to go out of your way to find others who are concerned about these things. But we're here, and we're limited, but there are things we can do. At least we can talk. So
Yeah, yeah.
so we covered a lot of ground. We covered a lot of topics, and so
Yes.
I really appreciate you coming on, John. This was helpful for me in a lot of ways.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I enjoyed the conversation very much, and it was a quite surprising conversation actually. I think it took some odd and interesting turns, and then ended up kind of in the same place that we started.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. It did. We kind of came back around. But yeah, so as I said in the beginning, if people want to follow your work, you're on Substack, correct? John Waters Unchained.
Yeah,
Uh,
johnwaters.substack.com.
okay.
And so,
And are there any, do you want to plug specifically any of your books that you think are relevant to what we discussed? I know I mentioned Lapse Agnostic, but yeah, any others you want to recommend to people?
well, I mean, if people are interested in knowing kind of what's been going on, what was going on in Ireland up to like about 5 years ago, my last book was called "Give Us Back the Bad Roads," which is kind of like a letter to my father, who at that point is dead for 30 years, and basically saying, "Look, this is what we've done to your country. This is what's happened." So it's good. That's kind of a primer. It's a very eccentric book in the sense that there are different layers and elements in it. It's not all about politics or ideologies, but some of it is, and some of it is very personal, and some of it is, perky, and it's a kind of an odd book. It's that I deliberately wanted it to somehow to represent the essence of life in a certain sense, if that doesn't sound too pretentious. I mean, I want to replicate the kind of contours and the rhythms of everyday existence, rather than just writing a book about something. I wanted the book to be something itself. So so if people are interested in Ireland, I think they should be, because Ireland is a very salutary kind of story for America, I think, and a lot of people are beginning to see this now, that it's of course, we're becoming under the influence of America in a big way, and always have been, but much more intensely, and not in a good way. And all the bad stuff that's happening in America is sort of flooding out, is overflowing into Ireland, and people should become aware of this and see why things are happening the way they're happening. And so I mean, that's probably my more recent book, my most recent book. There's another book going back 10 years before, which is called "Was It for This," which is a line from a Yeats poem. Really starts talking about the collapse of the Irish economy and why that happened. But it's much more a cultural book as well. I mean, the two books are kind of connected in lots of ways, because one is a development of the other. So that's there. I have 10 books and all, but as I say, Lapse Agnostic is a book about faith and my own journey. I hate that expression, but and also I wrote a follow-up book to that, which is called Beyond Consolation, which is again a development of some of the ideas in that book, based on the whole idea, the proposition challenging the possibility, is despair a rational response to reality, kind of thing. Should we be getting more and more scared the older we become, really? And I try to explain why I don't think this is a good way to look at reality, and so that's kind of, so yeah, the books are all different. They're quite they're eclectic in terms of, but they're almost all about, everything is about Ireland, always Ireland, as not just about itself, but as a motif for the universe and for reality.
Yeah. No, it's interesting starting from the particular. It enables you to understand.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing, Stephen. That just occurs to me, because that's an amazing thing that I've wrestled with all my life in relation to music. And it always fascinated me that artists are, for a long time, American artists could write very particularized songs about particular places, like Nebraska, Bruce Springsteen, that album. At that time, it wouldn't have been possible for an Irish artist to do that, to take, Roscommon and write an album about Roscommon, because it would be seen as kind of Hicksville, or just completely naff. And that's still a bit true, but there was a couple of bands. I mean, there was a band called the Saw Doctors who kind of took that on, and they did really get over it in a really good way. They made both songs. I mean, one of their songs is about a road, very like an arterial road that runs through the west of Ireland. It's called the N17. So they have a song called the N17, which, it's like Route 66 Irish style. But that was impossible in Ireland. And that was another symptom of that post-colonial thing. And it was overcome simply by a band saying, look, we don't care. We're just going to do this because we love this country, and we're going to write songs that celebrate that love. And it's that simple, really, to overcome these pathologies. If you know they're there, or if you sense they're there. I'm not saying they would describe the pathologies in the same way as I would, but they have the same sense that there's something not right about this, that you can't write a song about a county in Ireland in the way that you can write a song about a state in America. And that's, I think, a really salutary way of seeing this kind of post-colonial problem thing.
Yeah, no, because it's the inverse of the colonial problem. It's rather than starting from the outside and imposing it on the particular, you start from the particular and then move again to the global level. But yeah, so no, so
Yeah.
check out John's Substack, the books he mentioned, and yeah, again, thank you, John, for coming on.
Thank you very much, Stephen.